while we got this up on the bench, just real quickly, from the date codes I can see on all the tubes. Date code right there on the transformer as well, 425. Down here we have Rolla speakers. 285 is Rolla. 4 is 1954, 25th week there as well. Same over here. I think that's the same week even, yep. And all of these tubes are original as well, just judging by date codes, I believe. I didn't really look at a couple of these RCAs, but I just kind of glanced as I was putting these last ones in. And they're all original, and they're very clean. And the chassis is very clean. So, you know, this thing is probably well taken care of. The speakers are clean as well. It doesn't really account for the wear that I'm seeing on this cabinet. Maybe somebody tried to clean the cabinet too much or something, I don't know. Let's go ahead and fire this thing up and see what kind of condition its condition is in. Yeah, yeah, oh yeah. One of the cool things about my current setup is I got this arm that I made out of that newer, whatever. This is an arm to hold a microphone like that, but I have actually modified it to hold my camera, so I can do all my bench stuff by kind of moving it around and moving it down like this, and kind of leave it, you know, in places, and it's kind of out of my way. If I need it out of the way, I can put it up here. And also when I'm doing demos, I can just swing it around like this, and here's my stuff. I plug my camera in and boom, set it right up there, and there's my demo space. Okay. Alright, so I fired this thing up just a second ago to test it out. I noticed that the speaker was buzzing when I hit a low note, like the speaker's blown or something. But then I kind of was looking and poking around back here and noticed something that I want to show you now, and you see that right there? That is called red plating tube. That's one of the 6v6 output tubes, and it's definitely red plating, and is a good sign that something's not biased correctly on that output. So, so here is where our demo will stop before it even starts, really. I noticed the speaker was again buzzy, like you know, it may have been blown, but I think what I want to do is service the amp, not and reserve judgment on that until the end, and then we'll come back and look at the speakers. This one was making a strange noise, like a bzzz kind of a thing, and this one was making an all-out buzz, a low buzzy sound, like the speaker cone was rubbing, like we were getting some coil rub. Oh, so, you know, with an amp like this, man, with those Rollas, the recones on those, you know, I don't even know if they make kits for that. I've never actually gotten into reconing. That's not something I do. That's something I've meant to learn. I would like to learn and get into and do. But it is not something that it's not a service I offer yet, put it that way. I would rather practice on a few of my own things before going into a customer's vintage amp like this. So that's going to be off, you know, out of the question. The other thing he could do is do what a lot of people do with these when one or more of these speakers go bad. That's take the output transformer off, move it somewhere to the cab, and replace the baffle with a new one, and put a 10-inch speaker in it. Now you can replace the outside grill where it pretty much looks exactly the same, but then from there on you would have basically a 10-inch speaker in place. And I don't know if that would work really on this model or not, because you see where the power transformer is? You would have to definitely have a 10-inch speaker with a very small cone like these old Rollas. I think I might actually have one of those with that small voice coil or a magnet like that. I'd have to look and see what I have, but as for right now, we know for a fact we have some red plating output tubes, so right away we suspect caps. Yeah, and truth be told, I actually suspected caps before this thing even arrived. Being from 19, or well, actually before the thing was even made, I suspected caps. Before I was even born and this thing was made, I already suspected caps. But these actually come apart from the front. So what we have to do first is get this front panel off of here. Yeah, somebody mentioned the other day that they noticed that I used hand tools a lot to get cabinets apart instead of power tools. And they said, "Oh, is there some reason for that?" And I said, "Yeah, because I forgot to charge my power tools." But no, seriously, if you do use power tools on an old cabinet or something like this, man, you want to put the sensitivity really low so that, or the ratcheting really low so that when it gets to the end, if it feels any pressure, it doesn't just strip out the wood or anything. That it actually, it will, the clutch will actually kick in and the thing will just spin rather than trying to turn anything. So, you can use power tools, but you just got to be really careful with them and know what you're doing with them. I'm not going to say never use them because that would be really a stupid thing to say. That's the kind of thing you say, because there's dummies out in the world who don't know what they're doing and don't know, how to use this or that. So you just put a blanket statement out so you're never liable for anything. I think that's a lot of people's default position, but I don't know. I like to think that people have a little bit of sense whenever they stop and consider something before they proceed. That's probably a mistake to think that, but I would like to at least retain some faith in humanity, because otherwise I would be a real cynical bastard. Okay. Let's look and see what we have here. Well, it looks like we have some Sangamo caps. Sangamo caps, that should be plastic coated paper caps, I'm pretty certain. And those are pretty much never good at holding up well. Every one of these really needs to be replaced. And I would guess the reason our tube was biased incorrectly while we're getting high plate current and red plating is because of one of these caps. I think what I'm going to do here at this point is pause, try to contact the customer, let him know that with these Sangamo caps, this is kind of what I thought. And we had a conversation about this, but he seemed as if he kind of wanted to reserve judgment until I got a chance to see it, which is wise. So what I'm going to do, I think here, is contact him at this point and let him know that these Sangamo caps really need to go. Every single last darn one of them. And also, while I'm in here, I would go ahead and replace this cap can as well. I will look and see what's in it. I forget. The thing is, he's a collector, and that's you kind of get into a sticky situation whenever you're working on a collector's stuff, because on the one hand, you want to respect the originality of something. If he's a collector, he obviously wants to be able to look at something from a historical perspective and say, okay, this is what this thing looked like when it came from the factory, which I hope these pictures will be revealing of that. So that will kind of satisfy that itch. If nothing else, he'll be able to see what this thing looked like. And it's very clean on the inside. I've got no reason to think this thing was ever abused or anything like that. But in its current state, if I don't replace these capacitors just wholesale, someone else is going to be, if not me, someone else is going to be back in here in no time. And he will wish that he had done that. So we may as well go ahead and replace them all. One thing I do notice about this amp, if I remember correctly, in the other one that I had, there was a bracket that went from this top screw down to this rear screw hole right here. So it went from up here down to here and was bolted in here as well. And what it did was it acted to keep this from bending up and down like this. So you really couldn't move this shelf up and down at all in relation to the front. And there was a bracket over here on this side too. I think, if I remember correctly, I'd have to go back and look at that other video. There's a bracket here that runs from the bottom of this chassis shelf up to the front top of it. There's a bolt up at the top that holds the top on, and then there's another screw with a nut on the bottom that holds that on. You got to remove that bracket entirely, and it's not easy to get up there to that top one to begin with, but then you've got another one down there that you can't get to at all unless you remove that bracket. This one does not appear to have ever had that bracket installed. There's no indication of scratches or anything like that. And you see right there, that looks extremely untouched. I mean, like there was nothing else there. Okay, just to demonstrate that I'm not crazy by thinking all these Sangomos need to be replaced, let's take a few examples here. Here are the two capacitors before the output tube. So here's one of the 6 V6s, here's the other 6 V6. Here's the grid of one of them, and there's the grid of the other. This is basically attached to the plate of the previous stage. If we were to follow the wire that hooks up to it, it would go to the previous stage. Well, there's one of them, 109 volts right there on that side. If we move to the other side of this capacitor, there should be virtually 0 volts. There are 24 volts on the other side of that capacitor, which is way wrong. This one has 117 volts DC on this side. On the other side, which is the grid, we have 5.5 volts, which is wrong. Again, that should be near 0. Over here, we have 113 volts on this side of this capacitor. On the other side of this capacitor, we have 24 volts. If we follow this along, here's another capacitor here. A little bit more is blocked over to there, so we're down to 1.1 volts. So this one's bad, but this one's also bad, and it's not even blocking what's remaining. There's a 1.5 volts right there. On the other side of it, there's going to be 70 volts. Here we've got another high voltage area, I think. Yep, 150 volts on the other side of that. That one, amazingly, is doing its job. So we found one good capacitor right there. Let's see, out of all the ones we've tested so far, one of them was good. This one we don't even really know about because it's too low voltage, but it's probably leaky as well. So yeah, fact of the matter is all of these need to come out of here, and it's actually so bad that if you follow this voltage, actually that's been leaked from this one, so 112 down to 26 volts through this resistor down to 24 volts. But if we follow that wire right there, that wire is actually going to this pot, so we've got 24 volts on the pot for the tremolo, which is obviously way wrong. So every single one of these capacitors needs to come out of here without hesitation. I have no problem saying that. And anybody who has one of these amps, if you have these Sangomos in here and you're not yanking them out post haste, then you've got a problem. So with 24 volts on the grid of that output tube right there, it is no wonder that thing is red plating. And then this one over here next to it, the other 6V6, it's no wonder that one would be running hot as well with the bias as far off as it is. We still have the death capacitor here, which needs to go. The only one that could probably stay would be this one, which is just a little tone capacitor. And then I guess the one that we found that was doing its job, I suppose technically could stay, but it's not gonna. We're gonna replace every single capacitor in this thing, and it's gonna be better for it. Alright, here we are back with this National amplifier. I've spoken to the customer and he's agreed we're gonna change all of these capacitors, these Sangomos. The tremolo did not work also, so I'm hoping that just simply changing these capacitors will probably take care of that also. But you can see there's There's a death capacitor right there that will end up coming out of here. There is a little bypass capacitor over here. There is also a can capacitor down here, which is a 10, 10, and 10. It doesn't really show any signs of physical damage or anything. There's no physical leakage or anything like that going on with this capacitor, and I could probably eke out, you know, a few more years out of this thing, and it might be all right. But while I'm in here, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and replace those. And I cannot find any 10, 10, and 10 capacitors like that are that profile. There are some that are larger, have larger bases, which would mean drilling this hole out larger. I don't want to go drilling on its chassis, so what we're going to do instead is replace it with 3 single 10 microfarad capacitors on the inside. And that will be a better decision, I think, than drilling in as you know, going and drilling this out larger. Also, we're going to change the 3-prong cord. We're going to change to a 3-prong cord. It still has the original 2-prong. We will clean the pots, clean all the sockets, clean all the input jacks, basically do a complete once-over of this thing. We also have potential issue, which we're crossing our fingers on these speakers. There's a potential issue with those. I did notice some noise with them. One of them sounded like it might be blown, or there might be some voice coil rub. Hopefully that is not the case. The other one also sounded like it might have some strange noises going on with that as well. But I'm going to reserve judgment on that until we change these capacitors and get some new output tubes. Also, the output tubes that are in this, of course, we're red plating. So with red plating output tubes, if they've been doing that for any length of time at all, they're either going to be dead or on their way to being dead. So I really think it's probably for the best to get a new match set in here now. Go ahead and bias them up correctly, or check the bias on them, make sure that's correct while we're in here. Otherwise, it's, you know, if you have to go back to a tech for a second time, usually you're going to end up paying more money in the long run the more trips you take, because you know, bench fees are usually so much. So we're going to try to knock it all out in one whack, and just pray to God that those speakers are not blown. I'm going to spare you having to watch the entire thing, but I'll just show you, give you an example of on one of these. Both of these are 0.02s, I believe. Actually, that's not the case. Look at this. Look at this crap. Okay, these are the two capacitors right before the output. Look at this. One of them is a 0.02, and the other one is a 0.05. Why do we have mismatched capacitors on the output? Is that in the schematic? Here's a schematic, and on the output we do indeed have a mismatched pair of capacitors there. So interesting. Maybe that's the secret of why these things sound so good. Okay, so essentially what I do on stuff like this, first of all, I know right off the bat that the death capacitor is going to come out of there, and it's not going to be replaced, so we're not worried about that. That can just come right out, and that gets it out of our way conveniently. These other capacitors, I'm going to clip these off, and I'm going to leave some lead. I'm not interested in these old capacitors. They're just going to go in a baggie, and it doesn't really matter. We don't need any leads on them for any reason. This is the 0.02 over here, and this is the 0.05, and I'm going to leave as much lead once again as I can. And usually I don't want to go any more than a couple capacitors at a time, otherwise you just end up forgetting what went where. So what we're going to do here is basically just J-hook all of these in. I'm not going to come back to the terminals on all of these. There's a good reason for J-hooking as a rule when you're doing something like this, rather than trying to desolder all of these leads. I know there are a lot of people who like to make all this stuff really tidy and really pretty, and I'm kind of one of them. But over the last, I don't know, probably few months, I've gotten into the habit of just J-hooking stuff, and there's a reason for that. If you come in here, for instance, and you start desoldering these leads, and you're bending them back and forth trying to get them off of these terminals, especially the terminals for the tube socket pins, you risk breaking the pin off. You risk doing all kinds of other damage to the circuit. That's just really unnecessary. There's no reason to do all that except for vanity. There's a lot of that in the tube amp repair community. You can go on some of the forums and stuff, and everybody shows off their work, and you know, the tidiest work gets the most applause and that sort of thing. And I totally understand it. There's a point of pride in that, and it does make some sense, you know, to be prideful in your work. However, on stuff like this, you are doing your customer a disservice by trying to pry this lead off of this terminal, and this lead especially off of this terminal on the tube socket, because what you're going to end up doing is just damaging the tube socket in the process of trying to make your work look pretty. Another thing I get asked a lot too is, oh, did you check your capacitors for polarity? Well, what polarity, you might ask? The only ones that are really polarized are the electrolytics, not these interstage capacitors, coupling capacitors. There are a couple videos on the net that you know, show you how to check for the outer foil on these capacitors. The problem with this is you can get really caught up in this. On an amp like this, it's really such low gain. By the time you check these for outer foils, and if you get every single one of them wrong, I guarantee you on an amp like this, you're not going to notice the difference in any practical sense. And the reason you're not going to notice a difference is because look at this amp. I mean, what do you notice about it? Every single lead is exposed. You know, just because this little foil, I mean, and plus there's a big difference between the size of a new capacitor and the size of an old capacitor. These old capacitors, they are marked on one end to show you what the outer foil is. So this is the outer foil, so this should go to the least potential, the most negative potential, or closest to ground, basically. This one will go to the highest voltage, the highest potential. So they have this conveniently marked for you on the old Sangamo. Well, look at the size of this thing. Look at the difference in size. Look at this difference in surface area. I mean, this thing is going to pick up a lot more radio frequency interference than this thing is ever going to do. This is more of an antenna, essentially, than this one is, with all the outer foil. But even still, without paying any attention to it, in an amp like this, you're not going to notice the difference. If you have a really high gain amp, perhaps like a Marshall or a Mesa Boogie, something like that, you know, the capacitors that are closest to the input, that are going to be whose noise is going to be amplified the most, yes, maybe in some situations you might have some issues, but for guitar amps in general, most of the time you're never going to notice a difference between the inner foil and outer foil. You can swap those around, and I contend, especially on an amp like this, I mean, look at this thing. You know, once again, okay, so this part is shielded. This little tiny thing is shielded, but what about the rest of this stuff? None of the rest of this is really shielded. So what are we going to do about all the rest of this? Where's our, are we worried about all the leads running to and from? Well, yes, we are worried about those leads normally, but in an amp like this, again, the gain is not high enough to cause motorboating, oscillations, other issues that, you know, lead to problems in the amplifier. You know, it's simply not going to be a big issue. So to all the you know, people who ask me, well, did you check the outer foil? Which one is the outer foil? The answer is no. I do not check the outer foil, and I'm not going to start checking the outer foils, because I do not believe in guitar amplifiers, low gain guitar amplifiers of this variety, vintage amps. It doesn't make a lick of difference. And, you know, if you want to do a scientific test or something and A/B it and go through all of the trouble of doing that, be my guest. If you want to wire an entire amp with all outer foils in the wrong direction, and then do the same amplifier under the same exact conditions wired the other way, and do some tone tests with all other things being equal, maybe you can arrive at something resembling the scientific method. Otherwise, you're really going off of little evidence to really support it. You know, the only time when that really might matter is if when, you know, maybe you have a 6-volt lead or something going right next to the capacitor, and you have an issue of space on a PCB board or something like that, where you have, you know, traces that are 6-volt traces or something right next to a cap, and you need to mitigate that noise. Yeah, you know, maybe in that situation and it's close to the input and it's a high gain amp, you know, you may notice some significant difference perhaps in the which way you orient that capacitor. But, you know, not so in an amp like this. It's just simply ridiculous to think that it makes that big of a difference, you know, especially if you're not having wires right up next to the thing. This power cord is also going to go, so I'm going to go ahead and clip this off. Actually, I'm going to leave some lead here for later in case we need it. Okay, so I have this whole thing recapped now. Here are the casualties. All the old Sangamos, one of the electrolytics there, the old can I left in the chassis here. We'll get a look at what was done. And once again, I basically J-hooked all of these in. Moved one of the electrolytic caps over to this position. And everything works as it should now. I'll show you what I mean. We'll do some of the same voltage tests that we did before, and we'll check the voltage on each side of these capacitors. Okay, we're about to do some voltage checks at various locations here, but before we do, I've got a little bit of a noise issue that's kind of intermittent, and I think one of these preamp tubes is a little bit microphonic. Now, I have not yet changed the output tubes yet either. Still waiting for those replacements to come in, so but those are on order and we should have those soon enough. But let's look at some voltages here. If you'll recall, here at this location we had, you know, upwards of 150 volts before, which we still have. But also, actually I think it was a little bit lower even. It was 120 something, I think. So we've increased the voltage at this point a little bit. And on the other side, we have very, very near zero. So that tells me this capacitor is working perfectly as it should. Here we have 148 volts on this side, and over here on the other side we have next to nothing. Now let's just check a couple of voltages here. We're at 296 right there, 3 1/4 right there, and on down the line over here at this point we have 231. We should see nothing here on this pot. If you'll recall, we had like 25 volts right here at this position. And we have almost nothing, almost no voltage at all right there, as it should be. Here 144, other side nothing. And further down the line, obviously we're going to have nothing. Let's see, here we have 91 volts, other side nothing. Okay, there we have 189, and on the other side we have nothing. So all of the capacitors now are working as they should, and if you're in doubt about one of your amplifiers, you can do this simple check to see whether or not your capacitors are working as they should. If you put your probe on the leg of one of your capacitors in your amp, and you get a voltage, a higher voltage, say in you know, the 80s, 90s, 100s, you know, up along that range, check the other side of that capacitor and see if you have 0 or close to it. And if you do not, if you have something upwards of 25 volts like we were seeing on this this pot before, then you've got a problem with your capacitors. So that's a good case in point of how tolerant also a tube amp can really be, because this thing actually did fire up and did make noise, and you could play through it before the output tubes started to red plate and go haywire. But you know, you could actually get sound out of the thing, and it would operate. It just wasn't operating in a healthy fashion, and without changing on an amp this age, man, from the 1950s, if you are not coming in here and changing all of the caps in something like this, you're just spinning your wheels, man. You're wasting your own time. You're wasting your own money, especially if you're having somebody else do the work. You're going to end up having to take your amp back and forth to a technician 2, 3, 4 times to try to get the thing to work. We can see here the tremolo works as it should also, and that's again due to the fact that our capacitors work.